Hello, welcome to the Anti-Racist Film Club. Blah, 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 blah. Hello, welcome to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast, a production of The Commons, the online faith space created by the South Sound Methodist Co-op. But for the purposes of this podcast, we're a bunch of people excited to watch movies and also grow together through the lens of anti-racism. I'm your host, Lauren Fontanilla, and today I'm joined by Pastor Denise Roberts from Lacey St Andrews. How are you today, Pastor Denise?
I am doing fabulous, thank you.
So, for the month of February, the film that we've chosen is Lee Daniels The Butler. Had you seen this film before?
I have. Several years ago, I was watching an online sermon, and the pastor mentioned the film. And so I put it on my list as something to check out.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't get around to it for quite a while, but I have watched the film. Although I have to say that I tend to avoid movies that display the adversity faced by African Americans. You know, it's easy to get kind of an idea of what the movie will be about. But I decided to watch it. I suggested it to my clergy colleagues in the Anti-Racist Film Club as we were developing the schedule for this season.
Mm-hmm.
And they agreed it could be a film worth viewing.
That makes sense. Is it coincidental that we're watching this film, which has a lot to do with the history of the civil rights movement during African American History Month?
It's not coincidental that we are watching a film that is based in the African American experience.
Mm-hmm.
But it is coincidental that it just happens to be this specific film.
Well, it lined up pretty well.
Yeah, I think so. Actually, more than I had anticipated.
Yeah. All right. Well, could you tell us a little bit of why this film was chosen for the Anti-Racist Film Club? Why you brought it to the co-op?
Oh, sure. The film starts in the 1920s. And I think one of the first things that people will experience is a sense of dislocation because it starts with a number of African Americans in a cotton field picking cotton.
Mm-hmm.
I think the dislocation is that you'll be watching the film and you're thinking you are watching slaves in the field.
I mean, yeah, that was my initial because I didn't really know what the film was about, and so that was what I initially thought the first time I saw the scene.
Okay, so my sense was good then. Yeah, it's a little bit dislocating, and it takes you a second to recognize. Oh, wait a minute, this was afterwards. So
It's more of a sharecropping era.
It's exactly a sharecropping era. So I kind of like that there's some dislocations that happen throughout the film. You kind of wonder what time is this and where are you? And I think that's helpful as the movie progresses. Yeah, does that help?
Yeah, and also just thematically, the Anti-Racist Film Club highlights voices of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, and this is definitely a film that's not just made by those voices, but also definitely seeks to highlight them in a way that's very textual. Some of the films that we watch don't do it as overtly as this one does.
Yeah. And what I would add to what you just shared, Lauren, is that I think probably in our lives there have been many times we have said or wished that we could be a fly in the wall when some important discussions were taking place.
Mm-hmm.
And so through this movie, we get to see someone who was that fly on the wall. For 38 years, Cecil worked in the White House, and it is just amazing to even consider what he heard during all of that time.
Right, because this film, for those who may not know, is inspired by a true story.
Yes.
A lot of the language around it, it's like it's not based. Okay, it is based on the life of a specific person, but they took a lot of creative liberties.
Exactly.
And so Cecil Gaines is the main character of this film, but his life is inspired by the real life White House butler, Eugene Allen.
And it's a film that it really is about race relations. It addresses the really challenging parts, the hard parts of historical race relations in this country. And I think it's helpful to the Anti-Racist Film Club because we want to and we need to be able to better understand the boundaries, if there are boundaries of conversation about racism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a subject that we want to treat gently. And part of that gentle treatment is because we recognize that our country does not necessarily agree on a future of racial equality.
Yeah.
That's not a given. And so always we want to be respectful.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to hop into a little description of this film so that we're all on the same page as we begin to really dig into the details of the plot.
Sure.
Lee Daniels The Butler is a 2013 American historical drama written by Danny Strong and directed by Lee Daniels. Inspired by a true story, the film centers on the father son relationship between a White House butler and his son, a civil rights activist in the mid 20th century. Mid and late 20th century. I got the dates mixed up a little bit while I was writing this, but I think the son story starts in the 50s and ends in the 70s ish, I think.
Yes, that sounds right.
Cool. Based on the story of real life Eugene Allen, The Butler examines the fictional life of Cecil Gaines. We follow Cecil from the time he was a young boy witnessing his father's murder on a cotton farm to his long career of service in the White House, all over the backdrop of the American Civil Rights Movement. Simply put, Lee Daniels The Butler is a testament to what it truly means to be a witness to history, a history that's more recent than we often care to remember.
Excellent. Yes.
So, where do you want to start with our discussion of this film?
Oh, let's start with Cecil. He is the primary character in the film. We get to see him first, as you mentioned, as a young child, and my guess would be maybe 9 or 10 years old, and he sees his mother brutally raped and then his father brutally killed.
Mm-hmm.
So just in the initial, I don't know, quarter of the film, there is definitely some violence, and just a heads up about that.
Oh, yeah, actually, there's a lot of trigger warnings in this film, or a need for trigger warnings in this film.
Yes,
There's depictions of great violence against many people, also pretty graphic depictions of lynchings, especially in the very beginning.
yes. And you mentioned that we kind of follow that the backdrop is the civil rights movement, but every once in a while throughout the film, we get a sense of what's also happening in South Africa,
Oh, yes, yeah.
because there's a civil rights movement and there's apartheid going on in South Africa, and there's a fight against apartheid.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that backdrop as well in terms of what's happening in the US.
Mm-hmm.
I can't, it's not a movie that you would say you enjoyed, I thought.
It was a little difficult to watch at times, pretty intense.
It was. It was. It was a great storytelling, though, of a man's life, and as he navigates through a country that limits him and deprives him and despises him solely because of his color,
Mm-hmm.
and throughout all of that, how he manages to maintain his dignity.
Yeah, I mean, dignity and honor, even in a role that's seen as subservient, not just by the people that he is literally serving, but also family members,
Yes,
especially his son. There's a lot of tension between what his son Lewis thinks of his father's career, as this is something that's not honorable. But I think what the filmmakers are trying to argue is that there is a lot of dignity in Cecil's character.
absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting throughout Scripture. You always know something interesting is going to happen when a text says that a new generation arises and they didn't know the past, they didn't know God.
Hmm.
And so, this new generation, they have a different mentality, they have different concerns. And we see this played out between Cecil the father, who grew up in the Jim Crow South, and his son, who didn't have that experience. His son, Lewis, even though his father taught him his values,
Mm-hmm.
he can see the world that is shifting in ways that neither of his parents could even imagine.
Exactly.
And even the extent to which they can imagine it, they're very fearful of it. It's very scary to them.
Yeah.
And so throughout the movie, there's tension between the eldest son and the father. I think throughout the movie, certainly the concept of assimilation comes up, not just assimilation, but freedom and justice. And the movie digs into how we're defined by our experiences, how concepts like assimilation and freedom and justice translate across the decades and even through and within families.
Mm-hmm.
Cecil the father and Lewis the son have very, very different ideas about navigating life in a white world.
Right, yes.
And there's very much tension, incredible tension between the two because of their viewpoints.
I think what's really cool about the film is that it doesn't come down on either side in the end, because we're supposed to view both Cecil's actions and Lewis's actions as them pursuing freedom and justice in the way that they know how,
Yes.
and that neither one was really right and neither one was really wrong. It was always a mix of doing what they thought was best to the best of their ability.
And they're also limited in terms of what they can do by the time in which they live.
Oh, absolutely.
In one of the opening scenes, the father takes one step, just one step towards the white man who raped the mother, and he's shot, and nothing happens to him.
Mm-hmm.
There's absolutely no recourse that the black people have. Lewis, I think, a couple of decades later, perhaps could have gone to the police or gotten some kind of help, or there may have been some recourse for him. But when his father was a young child and saw this violence, there was nothing that he nor the people around him could do.
Yeah, Lewis's worldview just isn't very influenced by the situation or the world that his father grew up in. And Cecil tries to explain it a few times. At one point, I don't know if it's him who says it or someone else, but that like a white person can kill a black person and never face any consequences. And Cecil knows this from firsthand experience. So it's a very formative memory,
Yes.
and Lewis doesn't, and it's not a lesson that he takes to heart in terms of personal danger to his well-being, and more of like and that's not right and that I should fight for it.
Exactly.
So it's not that he doesn't care, that he disagrees, it's that it's not limiting him in the same way.
Yeah, I think it's more theoretical,
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say.
where it was absolutely real to Cecil.
Mm-hmm.
It made me, I came away thinking about assimilation and just pondering if assimilation is part of the moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a period in which assimilation is necessary? I'm still pondering that. And the whole idea of the moral arc, I'm pondering because, when I say those words, I get this idea in my mind of this nice, smooth arc.
Mm-hmm.
And now I get this idea in my mind of something that looks more like a sawtooth blade. It's,
Mm-hmm.
that arc is not smooth. It's ragged and jagged, and it cuts and it slices and it pinches and it's uncomfortable. And justice is like a baby, but you go through a lot of labor pains to have that baby. And maybe you never have it. Maybe it's just the labor pains.
There are two things that the comment about the arc of just not the arc of justice. The yeah, wait, oh my gosh, what is the
Oh, the
phrase?
arc of the universe.
Yes. In one of the interview clips I was watching with Lee Daniels, he talks about the way that he was interpreting Danny Strong's script as the character arcs of the different presidents as being the moral arc of the universe. And I think that makes so much sense with your the version of the jagged sawtooth blades, where each new administration comes in and they have these big ideas, or they hate the way that the previous one did it, and so there's fighting and trying to undo the past in some way. But each president then makes strides forward or backwards or sideways laterally, but either way, if you look at the entire history, even if it was painful, it still bends in a direction towards justice.
Yes, even if it's painful.
Yeah, and there's definitely certain presidents that Cecil liked more. Because of course they're experiencing the administrations through his eyes, but presidents he liked more, respected more throughout his long time of serving them.
Exactly. And some he seemed, for the most part, he was always hopeful that things would change and things would get better.
Hmm.
But you're absolutely right. He saw more energy towards this issue from some presidents more than others.
Right. The second thing it reminded me of when you mentioned assimilation and the way that the film brings it up, one of the times it explicitly brings it up is during the scene where they're discussing the films of Sidney Poitier.
Oh, yes.
I mean, as a film club, that's something that we should probably talk about. I had just recently heard about In the Heat of the Night. It's not a film that I had seen before. And so I learned about that film and sort of the controversy about depicting Sidney Poitier's character as like the perfect ideal of what a white person wants a black person to be.
Yes.
And I had heard that argument, and then I watched this film a couple of days later, and it was very, very fresh for me. And so I wanted to know what your thoughts were on both In the Heat of the Night, and then they also bring up Look Who's Coming to Dinner.
I haven't seen Guess Who's Coming to Dinner,
Guess Who's
and
Coming to Dinner. That's what it's called.
In the Heat of the Night, that's Detective Tibbs, right?
I think so. I haven't seen it yet. It's on a list of some sort now.
Yeah, and the comment made in the movie was something about kind of niceness is a product of whiteness.
Mm-hmm.
I think just demonstrating that there is a box of behaviors of black people that are acceptable to whites, particularly during this time. You could be invisible, you could be a great servant, but nobody wanted to hear anything that you had to say. So speaking up was not in that box. Lots of things were not in that box. Looking at people the wrong way, or looking at people too much, or looking white people in the eye was not in that box of social behaviors. And so that's kind of a description of I think Christian niceness,
Mm-hmm.
that blacks are going to stay in the boxes that whites have put them in. Blacks would do it because it's safe. Whites are comfortable with blacks doing it because it continues to make them comfortable.
Right.
But, in terms of the movies that Sidney Poitier does, if he does the role that is inoffensive to whites, then that's great. That's okay. It's in that box. You would not see a Malcolm X, for example.
Yeah, I mean, and the box. One of the arguments that Cecil makes is like, oh, like Sidney Poitier is winning award for his portrayal of this character. How could it not be good? It's making all these strides and creating firsts for the African American community in terms of film representation. But Lewis's argument is that he's working so in the box that it's not pressing any bounds really, or the progress is too slow.
Exactly.
It also reminded me of Hattie McDaniel, who was the first Black person to win an Academy Award, I think.
Right.
But it was for her role in Gone with the Wind as a subservient, tropey character who was not necessarily a kind representation of the African American community. And I want to say, anecdotally, she wasn't invited to the ceremony to accept her own reward.
Oh, okay.
I was trying to find that quickly, an article about that. So I'll link it in the notes below this episode if I can find it. But yeah, I had heard that somewhere.
Yeah, that would make sense given the time that she wouldn't be allowed in.
Yes, that would have been in 1934.
Oh yeah, I didn't realize it was that early, but wow.
Mm-hmm.
I was as you were sharing, I was thinking about just the fact that particularly at this time when America would have characterized itself as a solid Christian country,
Mm-hmm.
the ways in which the country, has aligned itself with empire is just so antithetical to the gospel message from Jesus. And I find myself, boy, I'd like to be a fly in the wall of some of the churches then. What were people hearing in churches that allowed them to think that their behavior towards non-whites was okay? And yeah, how is that okay? What do you do? Do you go to church and hear that it's stealing is against God's commandment, but then when you steal people from another country, that's okay? I just find myself really curious about how all of that got compartmentalized.
Yeah. It's just occurring to me that this film is largely divorced from explicit religion. Like, I can't think of many scenes where characters talk about faith.
There's not much discussion, but there's a couple of times in the background in the Gaines household, you see a cross on the wall, like there's a cross above their bed,
Oh, yes. And candles, I think, too.
and towards the end, when he and his wife are sitting at the table, she asks for her Bible, but no, not any not any specific discussions about faith. Yeah, I noticed that as well.
Yeah, it also seems like refreshing in a way to have it be so in the background, because I think that's another stereotype that gets put on movies of the era and black characters, is that they're extremely religious, or that I don't know. It's a thing that comes up in a lot of screenplays where I don't know. I almost feel like it's a nail that gets beaten on the head very often,
Sure.
and so to have it just be a natural part of the story where the characters are religious and that they do have personal faith journeys, but that it's not the only thing about them. That they are fully complex and well rounded in other ways. It seems refreshing to me.
I agree with you. Yeah. As I reflected on Jesus kind of in the background, that they weren't saying a lot of things like, God's going to take care of this, God's going to make things better for us,
Hmm.
or they didn't even necessarily say that Jesus, who throughout scripture shows a desire to help those who are poor and in need, they didn't even say that, the issues of justice, which they were looking for justice. They didn't know that this issue of justice was something that Jesus would particularly care about.
Hmm.
So I think there was a light background of that, but nothing that was really illuminated in the movie.
Yeah. What other aspects of the film did you want to bring to the audience's attention?
It's kind of interesting because this film reminded me of my parents. They would have been born, they would have been young kids, and my dad in North Carolina and my mom in South Carolina at about the same time, grew up as sharecroppers on cotton plantations. And
Mm-hmm.
it was kind of interesting. I don't know if you noticed, but there were a couple of times in the film where you could see the black characters kind of disengaging themselves from black characters who had less than they did.
I had not noticed this.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, I can't think of the specific, but I remember Oprah's character. Oh, I know it was, she was talking about Emmett Till,
Oh, yes, yes.
and she said those people down south just did such a terrible thing to her son. And they started talking about people in the South as being a little bit backwards, I guess. I'm not sure what you would call it.
Hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
I had that same experience with my family. They were both from the South, but when they moved out, it took me a long time to understand they really left that behind. They totally left it behind. As an example, for instance, they were very, very poor. We were poor when we lived in Baltimore. My parents had 8 kids. And you would kind of think that my mom would make our clothes, in the 60s and 70s, that she would have sewed clothes for us, that she would have done things like had a garden to make food,
Mm-hmm.
to have more food to make it last, that she would have canned and done all of that stuff. My mother did none of that. No one in my neighborhood did any of that. And the reason they didn't is because that was country living. They thought that was country living.
Mm-hmm.
That was having to get by on the land. And now they were big city people and they were going to live as big city people. And so I saw there are just a couple of things that were said in the movie that I thought, oh yeah, I know exactly what that mentality is. That having to live off the land in that way was hard and harsh. And now, if you want something to eat, you go out and buy it.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to go out and slaughter an animal. You don't have to grow it. You go out and buy it. You don't have to make a dress. You go out and buy a dress. So that just kind of brought back some things for me. And
No, I hadn't noticed that at all. But now that you talk about it. Yeah, there's definitely a few instances in the film where that type of language or the way that they talk about different groups of people definitely comes up. And as people go and watch this film for the club meeting, I would definitely encourage you to look out for those.
Yeah, yeah. There was another part of the film that really struck me, and it was towards the end when I think Cecil and his wife are remarking that they went to the voting poll. They just kind of walked by
Hmm.
2 or 3 times. They kind of would go back just to, I don't know if they wanted to make sure it was there, or I think I would describe them as being giddy. The whole idea that they were going to be able to vote, it made them so happy. They were giddy and they were so excited. It was like Christmas morning that they went and looked at the place, even though it wasn't time to vote yet, and they went back and looked. That was totally my parents. That was totally my parents. I don't know if I've shared, but my parents, when they went to vote, would get dressed up in their Sunday best. My father would wear a suit with a vest and a hat. He would carry his pocket watch. My mom would dress up in her Sunday best and wear gloves and get all of us dressed up and then march all of us down to the school where they voted. There was in my house there was God, there was voting, there was family. That was the hierarchy. That's how important voting was to them.
Yeah.
And so I saw a little bit of that towards the end of the film, especially when they were voting for Obama.
Yes.
It was I've got heaven here on earth. And that kind of brought tears to my eyes because I thought, "Oh my gosh, I've been there. I know what that's like."
Yes, that was one of the details that I could have sworn that was made up for this film, because it always, everything says it's inspired by a true story. And I'm like, oh, there's no way that this person would have lived and experienced the voting. Like, that's such a perfect ending to the film. But that was one of the most accurate scenes to what had really happened to Eugene Allen, is that he and his wife were on their way to the voting polls. Unfortunately, his wife did pass away the day before she was able to cast her ballot, but Eugene Allen did cast his, and that was for the Obama's first election. And then this film came out in the context of just after his second election, because this film came out in 2013.
Right.
And it's definitely made in a political climate and a media climate that is very different than if this film had been made 6 years later, 7 years later. If it came out now, I don't think that the film would be the same. I think there would have been differences in editing and writing, because it seems very, very hopeful at the end.
It does. It does. I was just kind of thinking about what you said. If it were made later.
I think it might not be as sentimental.
Oh, okay. Yeah. It might have more of an edge.
Yeah,
I can see that.
that could be that there's been films that have more of an edge coming after this one does. I mean, not that this film isn't intense. It has a lot of scenes that have edge. But overall, the message of the film has a lot of baked in sentimentality. But even like from Lee Daniels would then do Selma after this. And I think there's just a lot of films since The Butler that have a little bit more of that political edge, as you say.
Yeah. I was thinking that one of the things I also liked about the film, and it was a good reminder too, is how much I appreciate our young people and how much they have to say and how big their hearts are, and they're certainly going to develop their own baggage, but they don't have to take my baggage.
Mm-hmm.
I loved Lewis's fierceness in stating what was right and what was wrong and calling out man's inhumanity to man. I was really challenged by the teacher of the love school. Do you remember him?
Yes.
Who I think that was a clergy collar. I'm not 100% sure, but
I forget his name. He's another person that's a historical figure who is being played by an actor. But he was a student in the school of Gandhi. That's sort of the style of protesting that he was bringing to the United States.
Yes, and he states, he's so blunt. There's a scene where he's teaching young college students how to protest in a nonviolent way.
Mm-hmm.
He's getting them set up to go to the lunch counters, and he knows they're going to be thrown out. Actually, he knows they're going to be spit on, they're going to be beat up, they're going to be kicked, they're going to be treated incredibly bad.
Mm-hmm.
One of the young women says, you know, our weapon is love, but their weapons are going to be actual weapons. So what do we do? And
Mm-hmm.
he says, well, you could be killed. And he says it so bluntly. I guess I had a sense that that would be something worth thinking about. You know, Jesus going to the cross, we know that he wept in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Mm-hmm.
So there was some hesitation, there was some sadness. But here, this character is just stating, you could be killed, and that's just how it is, and just move on. Don't need, do you know what I mean? Kind of.
Yeah, there's definitely a sense of blunt brutality in not just the way that the characters are being treated during their actual protests, but also in the preparations for them. That like you need to be physically prepared.
And emotionally and mentally,
Yes.
I think you just have to put yourself in another place. You have to kind of like disassociate from your body because your body is going to be physically attacked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is a thread that gets started in the sit-in scene, which is sort of the beginning of Lewis's political activism. But then he goes on to be a freedom rider, and they have a scene where their bus is attacked by the Ku Klux Klan, and it's a very harrowing, dangerous, another scene of brutal violence. And then also he does marches where fire hoses are turned on the protesters.
Yes.
And all of it is extremely real, and it mixed in with footage of actual like news captured footage, and it's a blend of what is recreated and what is factual, just this is what happened and the audience needs to watch it and remember it.
Yeah, and a lot of the footage, it was so apparent that the objective of the white people was not to just move the black people off, you know, seats from the counter, to just physically
Mm-hmm.
move them away. It was really to beat the heck out of them.
Well, and also to humiliate them too,
And to humiliate,
like
yes.
like blowing ketchup in someone's face, like that doesn't do anything other than emotionally manipulate someone.
Yeah, it was, yeah, those were some pretty horrible scenes. Those were hard to watch.
Mm-hmm.
I really appreciated Gaines's character and that we got to see him over such a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking at the end of this movie, you know, until the very end, he was the lead character. I don't know if I would necessarily say he was the protagonist, because the protagonist is the one who changes, and he didn't really change until the end,
Mm-hmm.
when he was able to reconcile with his son. But I'm curious as to what you thought of that. Did you find Cecil to be just pretty steady and stalwart throughout the movie, or did you find his character had ups and downs?
I think that he is a bit of a subversive protagonist for reasons that are explicitly stated in the film.
Mhm.
Where Martin Luther King, the character in the film, I don't know if this is something he actually said. He has a little speech about domestic helpers and servants, and how he's talking to Lewis specifically, who's complaining about his father. And Martin Luther King says, actually, that the butlers in the White House and other places are important, and that the history is very important, and that they subvert the expectations of white people by being honorable and dependable. And that is exactly what Cecil's character is that you watch him experience a world that is constantly against him, and that throughout the entire time he remains stalwart and dependable and full of dignity and honor. And it's not a protagonist trait that is very common, but I think that by the end of the film, that's the point.
Mhm.
And he does have character growth. Like when he does reconcile with his son, there are personal things that he needed to overcome or change about the way that he views the world. But overall, the way that he interacts with society, I think the point is that he doesn't change, and that a weaker character would have let the messaging get to him,
Right.
and that it's a strength that he has.
I agree. Yeah. I think from Lewis and his father, we got evidence of two different types of leadership style.
Mm-hmm.
From Cecil, it was behind the scenes. He wasn't saying, I'm the one in charge, follow me. He totally modeled by behavior. And it got him into the White House. And with Lewis, it was very much about leading from the front. In fact, there really wasn't a time when we saw Lewis that he wasn't leading from the front.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he kind of had a microphone in front of his face, or he was talking to people. We don't see him in listening roles.
No.
I don't think we see him in listening roles at all, where that's like 90% of where we see his father in listening roles.
Mm-hmm.
Just, I like the two types of leadership styles that we see between the father and the son. And it shows us that, all leadership is not from the front. Leadership can come from the back. It can come from the side.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the big societal changes, which we see the presidents making with decrees and laws and things, those are all influenced by Lewis's actions, either directly or indirectly. And so, like, there's a scene where JFK says that his heart has been changed by the actions of Lewis.
Yes.
And so that's sort of the big societal changes. But then on the smaller scale, with Cecil's style of change, he gets all of the black staff at the White House equal pay. Eventually, he tries several times.
Yeah.
And it takes 20 years, but he does it.
I got kind of the sense that this was, I don't want to use the word a game between him and the guy in charge of the butlers, but I got the sense that this was something they did every single year, that every year
Mm-hmm.
Cecil was back asking for a raise for those people. He knew what the answer was going to be, but he was going to ask anyway. And eventually he asked the right person who made it happen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's definitely seen as a victory moment in the film. I'm not sure Lewis has any victories, because the change that he makes is so painful that he is arrested and he is beaten and he is brutalized, but his actions have massive ramifications and consequences for all of society.
Right.
So he is making a difference, but it doesn't feel like winning in the same way.
He did a little in the way he was able to get his master's degree. There was one point, he was in college and you kind of didn't know, was he actually going to school or was he spending all of his time in jail? Or I felt like he had gone off the rails, but you didn't have enough information. And so then we get a check in, it was years later, and you found out, oh, okay, he did finish and he got his master's degree and he actually ran for political office.
But he does eventually. I think at the very end of the film it's mentioned that he's a congressman, but the one election that we see him run for, he loses.
Right. But at least he did it. I mean,
that's true.
That's a lot. So I think he got some smaller, different types of wins.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was just a sense of the values that his father had. And I think the film showed us that our values are not totally dependent on our parents, that our values are also very much shaped by our culture. Our parents are not the only determinant of how we turn out. And in fact, if you look at Cecil and Lewis turned out very, very different from his father, even though his father was very influential in his life. And we didn't get much on the other brother. He passed away, but obviously they were very, very proud of their younger son, and it was quite a loss to them.
So if there's one thing that you want audience members to take away from this film as they watch it, what would that be for you?
I guess that I would say is, from generation to generation to generation, our understanding of the world changes. Our values also change to some extent. But at the same time, from a spiritual standpoint, I think God can work through all of that. God can work through any system that man puts before God. And we see this in this movie. I'm glad that at the end of this movie, love wins. And even though the powers that be are demonic forces in the world, love still wins. And I think that's the part that we need to remember.
That's extremely well said. Thank you for listening to the Anti-Racist Film Club podcast. If you haven't seen The Butler, it's currently available to stream on Netflix and various other online video rental sites. To learn more about the Anti-Racist Film Club itself, visit funcoly.org or follow the links in our description below. This is a monthly podcast, so be sure to follow us on whatever platform you're currently listening to, such as Spotify, Anchor, or Apple Music, so you don't miss our next upload. And feel free to share us with your friends, which is the number one way you can help support this podcast. But before we sign off, I just want to thank you, Pastor Denise, for leading our conversation today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
And that's everything I have prepared for in this obviously scripted outro. So, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Lauren.